Okay, so we're back here doing this second part of this 4-week course about early Buddhist texts, and we're thinking about imagery in the early Buddhist texts. Good, we're all on the same page. I'm trying to make this thing work. And here I've got to share the screen again. Oh my gosh, maybe I need like a driver next time. We are going to look at this text, not an image, but a text from the Buddha himself saying, I shall give you a simile, for it's by means of a simile that some wise or astute people understand the meaning of what is said. So sometimes when a teacher gives a talk, it can be quite clear to some people and very unclear to other people. You can give the same talk 3 times to 3 different people and they'll take 3 different meanings from it. And at the time of the Buddha, of course, there was no books, there was no YouTube, there was no podcasts, there was one chance to hear the teachings and remember them. And for us as people who live in this age of social media, devices that stream videos, I think we've forgotten the skill of even being to imagine things in the same way. We're not people who listen well. If I was to ask you, for example, those people who were here last week, to recall the 5 benefits of hearing the Dharma, no one, right? Fail. You at the time of the Buddha gives you a talk about the 5 benefits of listening to the Dharma. You go away, sit under a tree, you're like, oh dear, right? So we're not good at listening anymore and retaining information. We're also not good at imaging the things that we hear in our mind. We've lost that skill too. So perhaps you might hear something and you'd imagine it, you'd see it. This is something that we used to get from books. You would read a book and it would come to life in your mind. Now, I think because of the preponderance of things like video or memes or visual culture, we need to be shown, which is why I'm still showing images, even though these texts that I'm teaching were spoken. Anyway, so what I want to let you know is that the Buddhist teachings are replete with imagery. And sometimes we don't realize just how much of our teachings are visual. For example, this. The darkness of ignorance, delusion. Which, of course, is opposed to something like light, right? So we think in these terms, darkness, ignorance, delusion. And then the Buddha uses things like the image of the sun or a candle or a lantern to talk about destroying the darkness. Light destroys the darkness. And this, of course, is a very powerful image, right? That the light casts out the darkness. And it's a bit weird, actually, because our term for nibbana is enlightenment, which means bringing the light, whereas the actual term nibbana is the image of a flame going out. So it's kind of like, it's a bit annoying, isn't it, that happened? So this image of the flame going out is what nibbana is. But of course, the Buddha talked a lot about this quality that light has in dispelling the darkness. And so I'm just going to take you to an early Buddhist text. We're going to the Samyutta Nikaya, which is this fat book right here, the Samyutta Nikaya, the linked discourses. And we're going to this sutta called the Dutya Surya Sutta. Surya means sun, Dutya means second, and the sutta, of course, is the teaching. And it's number 56, chapter 56, and number 38. Chapter 56, number 38. So we're going to Sut Central here, which is where you can find lots of wonderful early Buddhist texts. And so you go up here to these breadcrumbs up here. We're in the Sutta Pitaka. So there's people last week who remember in the Sutta Pitaka, that's the basket of discourses. We're in the linked discourses, that's the Samyutta Nikaya. We're in this chapter here, the greater chapter, and then we've got this smaller chapter, the chapter about truth, and then we're in this even smaller chapter, and here we have this discourse. So these are all just ways of finding our sutta, and of course this is the number that we use. And so it says here, it's just a short sutta, I'll read it to you, but you can close your eyes and try to just visualize it. Mendicants, that means monks and nuns. As long as the moon and the sun don't arise in the world, no great light or great radiance appears. Darkness prevails then, utter darkness. Day and night aren't found, nor months and fortnights, nor seasons and years. But when the moon and the sun arise in the world, a great light, a great radiance appears. Darkness no longer prevails. Day and night are found, and months and fortnights and seasons and years. In the same way, as long as the realized one, that's the Buddha, doesn't arise in the world, no great light or great radiance appears. Darkness prevails then, utter darkness. There's no explanation of the Four Noble Truths, no teaching, no advocating, establishing, clarifying, analyzing, and revealing those Four Noble Truths. But when the realized one arises in the world, a great light, a great radiance appears, darkness no longer prevails. There's the explanation of the Four Noble Truths. That's why you should practice meditation, the Buddha says, learning the truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So that's a simile of the sun that brings light to the world. Simile, of course, is the Four Noble Truths. The core teaching of the Buddha is like the sun that destroys the darkness. And this is imagery. This is simile, right? Did you notice in that sutta the amount of repetition, right? You have like quite a lot of repetition. Of course, that's to help you remember, right? So you have the repetition, you have the thing, the analogy, the simile, and then you have the explanation of that simile, and the repetition and the image itself help you remember. Anyway, can't get stuck in that. We've got to keep going because there are over 1,000 similes in the suttas. This is according to Helmuth Hecker, who wrote a book about similes of the Buddha, and Caroline Reese Davis said she analyzed these suttas and the similes and said there's like over 568 concepts described by similes, which is a lot, right? It's memes. These are memes, ancient memes, and often these similes will be used in different ways. The same simile will be repurposed and used in a different way. Sometimes the same topics are used describing different similes. Water is the most common, not surprising, in a place where the Buddha lived with the Ganges River, right? And then other elements as well. And the Dharma is often compared to things like the rain falling on the mountaintop, going down the mountain, becoming lakes and rivers, and those giant rivers flowing out to the ocean, filling up the ocean. Something like samsara, the cycle of birth and death, rebirth and death over and over again. This is referred to as the flood, difficult to cross. Crossing the river, crossing the flood is going from the unsafe shore of samsara and suffering to the safe shore of nibbana. Let's see, generosity is sometimes compared to like a rain cloud. It rains everywhere, creating wonderful abundance. So water is a wonderful simile that's used often. Elephants are used quite often as similes. The Buddha himself is referred to as a bull elephant. And then we have all of these quotidian aspects of the life of people at the time of the Buddha, like talking about the khandhas as being like this is the aggregates, the 5 aggregates, as being like a house, or that we have urgent duties to do, like a farmer. And we also have imagery from things like hunting or potters. So we have imagery that was understandable to the people living at the time of the Buddha. These were common things that when he would say, oh, it's like this. Oh, I get it. Because it's something that they had seen that they could understand. And so, for example, this is the stock phrase of appreciation for teachings. So some of you remember last week I said there's a little bit of fiddling with the text, the redactors. Do you remember that word? The redactors, people who came along and did a bit of editing, bit of cleaning up, bit of neatening. And their task was to make, again, kind of like memes and to standardize definitions and things like that. So this is one of those standard definitions that we see in a lot of different suttas. And it goes like this: when someone hears a teaching, they'll say, excellent, Master Gautama, that's the Buddha. Excellent, as if he were writing the overturned, or revealing the hidden, or pointing out the path to the lost, or lighting a lamp in the dark so people with good eyes can see. Master Gautama has made the teaching very clear in many ways. So there's how many similes in this? Writing the overturned, right? Done, right? I had this wrong idea. And then I heard a teaching of the Buddha. It just feels right. This is something that we've all experienced. It's why we're here. We heard some teaching and we're like, oh, what have I been doing? It makes so much sense. Oh, it's like writing the overturned, right? It's a perfect description. Or revealing the hidden. I never knew that. Thank you for showing me. Thank you for giving me this teaching. You showed me something that I couldn't see. Powerful, right? Pointing out the path to one who is lost. Someone who's walked the path before us can show the path. Otherwise, we might take a wrong turn, right? And this beautiful image, lighting a lamp in the darkness. Again, that showing what is there that you couldn't see. And so this is how people appreciated the Buddha's teachings. Lots of great images, right? Nice. The Buddha was a master, absolute master of similes. Remember, he was a very educated person. He was accomplished in many different forms of oral literature. He had a great knowledge of many different traditions, the Vedic traditions and other Shramana traditions of teachings. And he also was a good poet. Extemporaneous poetry, this is like spontaneous poetry, was a thing. People would compose poetry on the fly. So they had a really rich vocabulary of imagery they had at their disposal and techniques to use them. And already I'm running out of time. So this is a beautiful, and I'm going to take you to the place that this lives in the suttas. I'm going to do this with a couple of these, but I'm not going to be able to do them all. This is my problem. There's so many similes. There's so many teachings by the Buddha, right? So here we go to this sutta about this, and it's in a rosewood forest. And here we're in the Samyutta Nikaya again. We're also in that large Mahavagga, and we're in the same chapter about the truths. And he asks the monks, what do you think? What is more? The Buddha has scooped up some leaves from the forest floor in the rosewood forest. What do you think? Which is more, the leaves in my hand or those in the forest above me? And the monks say, sir, the few leaves in your hand are a tiny amount. There are far more leaves in the forest above me. In the same way, says the Buddha, there is much more that I have directly known but have not explained to you. What I have explained is a tiny amount. And why haven't I explained it? Because it's not beneficial or relevant to the fundamentals of the spiritual life. It doesn't lead to disillusion, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That's why I haven't explained it. And so this is the Buddha saying, I know a lot of stuff. I've only taught you the necessary stuff. And it's a way of him kind of whittling down his knowledge to make it approachable to other people. And it's this beautiful image. A handful of leaves is all that I'm teaching you. And so in the same way, although I'm not enlightened and I don't know enough about anything, we can only look at a few similes, a few images today, instead of all of them. But you can read all of them yourselves. And I'll show you how you can do that later. So remember again that this is the time of the Buddha giving teachings, and that it was an oral culture. And the purpose of similes is twofold. Firstly, is to convey really complicated ideas in practical, simple terms that people understood. This is the purpose of them, right? The second purpose, of course, is to assist with memory. So you'll never forget, I hope, when I ask you next week, the simile of the quail. It's in there, right? Because it's visual, it gets drilled into the brain. And this is the case for me. Perhaps I'm a visual learner, but my teaching always relies upon these images that I found in the suttas. And I can remember them. And when I share them with people, they remember them. That's why these similes are amazing. We call them figures of speech in English. Probably ancient Indians had a completely different approach to this. These are ways that I'm doing this myself. Okay, this is me, not an ancient system. So the first thing is simile. Who knows what a simile is? Very good. One person. Metaphor. Who knows what a metaphor is? A few more. Yep. Who knows what an analogy is? Yeah, good. And the last one, allegory. So these are all terms that we find in literature, right? I'm going to explain each one as we go because I want you to understand that it's not just similes, it's not just imagery, that these things have a particular form. And the first is simile. So this is, of course, is a bit of an English lesson. This is when we use the words like or as to compare one thing to another. Like a little baby quail is like your meditation, your mind. Or my favorite sutta about impermanence and the brevity of life. And this, of course, is a classic Buddhist image, the dewdrop on a blade of grass. So there's this sage called Araka, and he was alive at the time of, he wasn't alive at the time of the Buddha. The Buddha tells a story about him. And in this sutta, Araka, the teacher, gives 7 images. Should we look at it? Do you have time? Good, we've got time. We can say late. And so this sutta is in the Anguttara Nikaya. Those people last week will remember that the Anguttara Nikaya, one of these ones here, maybe this one, yes, this fat one here, is full of suttas that are ordered according to the number of concepts in each of those suttas. So we're here in the Anguttara Nikaya number 7. How many concepts do you think are going to be involved? 7. No, Patricia, no, fail. No, so there's 7 things that are enumerated, and that was how they remembered where this sutta should fit. And if you're thinking, I'm reciting this chapter on the 7s, and I can't remember that 7th simile, you know that there's a 7th simile somewhere, right? So this is how the suttas were organized. And so Arika, this teacher, always wanted to remind his students that life is short, right? So the first image that we get is this, the Buddha talking about Arika, and Arika saying, life as a human is short, brief, and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Doesn't that sound fun? That's your life. It's short, right? Full of suffering. Be thoughtful and wake up. Or in another translation, think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the spiritual life. For no one born can escape death. And here comes the similes. Are you ready? It's like a drop of dew on a grass tip. When the sun comes up quickly, it evaporates and doesn't last long. In the same way, life is like a dewdrop. It's brief and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Think about this and wake up. Do what's good. Lead the spiritual life. For no one born can escape death. The second image is like when the rain falls heavily, the bubbles quickly, there's bubbles that come from the rain and they burst. In the same way, human life is like a bubble. It's brief and fleeting. The third simile is like a line drawn in the water. As soon as it's drawn, it disappears. This is what your life is like. It's brief. Think about this. Wake up. It's like a river from a mountain traveling far, flowing fast, carrying all before it. It doesn't turn back. It just keeps on going. Not for a moment, not for a second it turns back, but runs, rolls, and flows on in the same way. Life is like a mountain river. It's like a strong man who's formed a glob of spit on his tongue. He could easily spit it out. In the same way, life as a human is like a glob of spit, right? We just get spat out into the world and we dry up in the sun. That's it. That's us. It's like an iron cauldron that has been heated all day. If you toss a scrap of meat in it, it will quickly vanish. You know, when you put a little bit of meat into a hot pan, it just kind of sizzles and disappears, right? That's you. You're the meat. And the last one is a bit of an escalation. It's like a cow being led to the slaughterhouse. With every step, she comes closer to the slaughter, closer to death. In the same way, life as a human is like a cow being slaughtered. It's brief and fleeting, full of suffering and distress. Think about this and wake up. Do what's good and lead the holy life, for no one born can escape death. So once again, you see the similes rely upon these repetition, right? And the way, you notice how many of those images were about water as well, yeah? And you see the kind of escalation. That first image, that dewdrop on a blade of grass, like this is one of the ones you see always advertising Buddhist events and things like that. And people are like, oh, and people have this kind of like, oh, it's so nice. But the meaning behind it, which probably comes from this sutta, is terrifying. You're going to die. Think about that. Wake up. And so this is what the Buddha is pointing to when he gave these teachings. So when you hear these teachings and like you're listening, like those images should be like really burnt into your brain, and it's a good way to remember the teachings, right? You're going to die. So that's simile. You are like a glob of spit. Metaphor is different. We don't use the words like or as. And so instead, it's a direct similarity that is invoked. And one of the classic ways we can think about this is the very idea of a spiritual path, right? We talk about a spiritual path. It's not a spiritual path, not an actual path, it doesn't go anywhere. It's just an idea. It's a concept that helps us understand me moving from here to a destination, that I'm being guided, hopefully, by someone who knows where they're going. And the Buddha often talks about taking a wrong path. And he talks about a caravan leader taking them on the right path. Buddha himself is described as a caravan leader. He's a teacher. He's someone who shows the path. So this idea of the spiritual path is a metaphor, right? We also have a stream enterer. Do you know what a stream enterer is? A sotapanna is a stage of enlightenment. So someone who has entered the stream, someone who has attained this level of understanding, this person is said to be in the stream because within 7 lifetimes, they must become enlightened. They're flowing towards the ocean. They cannot go back. They can only go forward. Like that fast-moving mountain river can't go back, only goes forward. In the same way, when people reach this stage of enlightenment, they can kind of relax a little bit. I mean, 7 lifetimes is a lot, right? It's a lot of being a glob of spit. So we don't rest if we get to that stage. We want to get enlightened as fast as we can. So this is another concept. Like a lot of people don't think about this. Like, what does this mean? This stream enterer business. Like this is what it's describing. You know, you're in the stream of the Dhamma, and you'll reach the ocean. You cannot go back. A metaphor. There's heaps of metaphors. Darkness, of course. Another really common one in the suttas is analogy. And so an analogy is one thing compared to something else to make an explanatory point. So we're trying to explain something here. And one of my favorites is the rarity of human birth. Do you know this one? Sometimes it's the analogy of the blind turtle. In the suttas, though, it's actually got one eye. So let's go to the yoke with a hole. So you know what a yoke is, right? It's like a ring or something that kind of can combine 2 things within it. So it's like the middle thing. And the Buddha says, we're in the Samyutta Nikaya again in number 56. And this is the 48th sutta in that 56th chapter. Mendicants, monks and nuns, suppose the earth, you can close your eyes, was entirely covered with water. You got it? An earth entirely covered with water. And a person threw a yoke or a ring with a single hole in it. The east wind wafts at west, the west wind wafts at east, the north wind wafts at south, the south wind wafts at north. And there was a one-eyed turtle who popped up once every 100 years. What do you think? Would that one-eyed turtle popping up once every 100 years still poke its neck through that hole in that yoke? And the monks say, well, it's very unlikely, sir. And the Buddha replies, that's how unlikely it is to get reborn as a human being. And that's how unlikely it is for a realized one, the Buddha, to arise in the world, a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. And that's how unlikely it is for the teaching and training proclaimed by him to shine in the world. And now, mendicants, You have been reborn as a human being. A Buddha has arisen in the world, and the teaching and training shines in the world. That's why you should practice meditation and understand the Four Noble Truths. So this is powerful, right? This analogy makes an explanatory point. How difficult is it to get a human rebirth, to hear the teachings? Like a one-eyed turtle popping its head up once every 100 years, finding that ring. We're lucky, right? Like the Buddha is saying here, it's hard, it's tough. You should be really thankful you've heard the teachings. The point of this analogy is not only to show how rare it is, but to encourage us to get up that spiritual urgency. We're lucky. You better make the most of it, you know? You're a little turtle that managed to find the teachings. So it's powerful. Another one, I really like these ones. These are in the Anamataka Samyutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 15. And there's lots of verses which make analogies. And so I won't take us to this one, but the length of an eon. So an eon is like a very, very, very long length of time. And in Buddhist cosmology, there can be many, many eons. And the universe sometimes expands, sometimes it contracts. There's eons where there's no Buddha, darkness. And how long is an eon, I hear you ask? Well, imagine there's a giant mountain like this one, and there's a very soft handkerchief. And every 100 years, someone just lightly strokes the mountain with the handkerchief. An eon is the amount of time it takes for that mountain to erode. If stroked with a soft handkerchief. And so this is a long time, right? Now you can see it. Oh, well, I understand, right? This is a purpose. Similarly, he used like an image of mustard seed. Imagine there's a giant pile of mustard seeds and someone comes along every few years and takes a mustard seed. That's how long it takes. And these eons are useful for calculating things like the time you might spend in heaven or hell, right? Some eons in hell, like some beings in hell realms, they, you know, every eon the gate will open and everyone will rush towards the gate and then it closes and won't open for another 100 eons, right? Anyway, so these are ways that we make an explanatory point, analogy. And the last one is probably the most complicated. It's allegory. Who wants to have a go at defining allegory? No one. It's complicated. We don't really think in terms of allegory, but actually our culture is full of allegory. So the first one is when we have abstract principles, characters or figures. Think about the god of death, yeah? Or spring, Mother Nature. These are often used to express very large concepts that need a little bit of explanation. And they're symbolic. Sometimes they have hidden meanings which need to be interpreted. That's an important part. So, for example, here we have the image of the Buddha just before his enlightenment. And we talk about Mara. Do you know who Mara is? Mara is like the bad guy of Buddhism. Mara is the god of death in some ways. He's a trickster. He's an annoying person who comes along and always trying to take monks out of meditation or disturb the Buddha's peace. He's a character. He's also like all our bad qualities wrapped up in an allegory. So here we have this image of the Buddha just before his enlightenment. And there down in the left-hand corner, we see Mara, who's a god, by the way, in the Paranimitabhasavati Deva realm. He is one of the highest gods who delights in the creations of others and is always trying to torment people. So here we have Mara and what we call Mara's army. So before the Buddha got enlightened, Mara's army came along and tried to distract him with weapons and things like that. And there's a sutta, I won't go into it, but this is all, of course, allegory, right? There wasn't an actual army of elephants and beasts and skeletons coming to attack the Buddha. This is the 10 armies of Mara as described by the Buddha. Things like sensual pleasures, wanting to have ice cream when you're meditating, right? Discontent, not being satisfied, hunger and thirst is tanha, I'm not sure what that one is. Craving, sloth and torpor. These are all like qualities of our mind, right? That have been personified in the allegory of Mara. Does that make sense? So it's a very helpful tool, right? So instead of like saying you've got a mind full of defilements, you say, that's Mara playing a trick on you. And this kind of depersonalizes it, right? And of course, in the suttas, we see Mara coming along trying to disturb monks and nuns in meditation. And they say, I know you, Mara. I know you. And then Mara gets upset. Oh, I've been discovered. And he disappears right there because naming takes away the power. This is an ancient mythological power that if you can name something, you steal its power. So being able to name Mara means that these things don't attack you so much. Similarly, we have Mara's daughters who appeared after Mara failed and tried to seduce Mara. Who were they? Tanha, craving is her name. Arati, disgust, aversion, and raga, passion, lust. So these are Mara's daughters. These are their names, right? So it's pretty clear, like this is an allegory, right? This is a personification of those things. So these are kind of a little bit more obvious than some of the other allegories that we have, such as this one, the allegory of the fortress. How are we going for time? What's the time? What time are we supposed to finish? Oh, we haven't got time. Well, we've only just begun. So I will just very quickly move on. The allegory of the fortress is where each of the parts of the building have a particular meaning behind them, such as at the center of the fortress, there's a strong pillar, and that is later revealed, interpreted to be faith in the Buddha. Or something like the walls are later revealed to be wisdom, high walls. Or the moat is conscientiousness, hiri. And of course, something like the gatekeeper is, of course, mindfulness. So this image is presented and dissected so that we can understand each part. And then when you're meditating, you kind of put all this together. You've got this image. Oh, my gatekeeper is mindfulness. My center is confidence in the Buddha. So all of these things come together to support your practice. Do you see how this image works and why it's an allegory? Because it has an extended meaning and it needs to be interpreted. And there are several different allegories of a fortress in the suttas. So it doesn't always have the same meaning. It needs to be elaborated. So I wanted to share this with you because this is a way that you can get to know these similes without having to like search through these books, and take you to this place, Sut Central, which is sutacentral.net. It's a wonderful resource of early Buddhist texts on the internet. And there's an index of things like subjects, similes, names. That's where we're going to be going next week when we're doing like a who's who of the early Buddhist texts. And then there's this index here of similes, right? And so we go to like letter A, acrobats. an ancient city, animals. And each of these, of course, has a meaning to them. Can I share with you my favorite simile before we finish up? I mean, look at them all, right? And all of these will take you to like a sutta where that simile will be explained. And so this is like, if you're a visual learner, if you're someone who wants to have an access point to somehow get to know this vast body of literature, this is a way in. This is how I actually started more than 20 years ago using Access to Insight, where this list of similes actually comes from, thanks to the librarian John Bullitt, who put them together. These similes are a really good way. So like, I just used to come along and scroll along and be like, oh, fire. Okay, I'll check this one out. And then another time, oh, flames. I'll check this one out. Fly eggs. Well, that sounds interesting. Let's find that out, you know. And so this is a really approachable way. But to finish up, and also I just want to say there's this book by Helmut Hecker, who wrote a book kind of just bringing together some similes. It's a bit old-fashioned, but it's still useful.
What would you say?
I'm going to tell you right now. It's the simile of the dung carrier. And this is something that I think about quite often. And next week, we're going to meet this chieftain. Payasi was his name. See, once you kind of get into the suttas, like all these people become like friends or like, you know them. And Payasi was either a mad genius or a homicidal maniac. You can decide next week. But he's having a debate with a monk. And Payasi is refusing to budge from his position. He's a stubborn man and he's a powerful man. And the monk who's talking to him says, let me explain by means of a simile where you are at. It's a very long sutta, so I just find. And so it's the simile of the dung carrier. Well then, chieftain's Payasi, I shall give you a simile, for by means of a simile, some wise people understand the meaning of what is said. And here's the simile. Once upon a time, oh, look, it's going to take too long to read, so I'll just kind of like explain it. Once upon a time, there was a swine herd. You know what a swine herd is? Mm-hmm. Someone who has swines, pigs, a pig herder. And he went looking one day for some food for his pigs. And he found, you know what is good food for pigs? Cow shit, pile of dung. He found a pile of dung. They love it. And so he thought, right, this is great. And so he takes off his outer robe and he puts the dung in there. And as you see sometimes in India, he carries it on his head in a bundle, right? So it's something that he's holding on to, something that's heavy, something that he prizes, something that he thinks good. So he holds it on his head and he starts walking. As he starts walking, it starts to rain. So the situation has changed, right? Something has shifted. And as it rains, of course, the dung, which is dried, becomes a bit sloppy. And as it becomes more sloppy, of course, it's moving slowly down his head and body, and he's covered in shit, right? And so people see him and they're like, what are you doing? Put down that bundle. No, I've been carrying it a long time and I refuse to put it down. Put it down, put it down. You're mad. No, you're mad. You're mad. This is my food for my pigs. I've been carrying it. It's mine. And so, of course, this is a simile to describe us. You know, sometimes we attach ourselves to our views and we refuse to put them down. We've been holding on to them for so long. And at the end of this simile, at the end of the sutta, actually, we find out that Payasi had just been holding on to this view out of stubbornness. He didn't really care about this particular view that he held. He just was stubborn, and people knew his view, so he refused to give it up. And so this is such a powerful image, someone like carrying something which is stinky and dirty and messy, but refusing to put it down because they're attached to it. And if you're wise, once you start to get covered in shit, you might want to rethink the situation, yeah? And in the same way, sometimes we're very attached to our views. We refuse to give them up. And this is the meaning of that simile, which is one of my favorites. And I say it's my favorite, but it's just my favorite yesterday when I was thinking about it. Because there's so many wonderful similes in the suttas. And this is why I'm trying to get you excited about them. Like all of these ones that I'm not going to be able to show you. And I did want to ask you, what is a simile for your spiritual practice? What is a simile for your spiritual practice? Are you like a tobogganist sliding down the mountain? Are you like a black hole sucking in information and heavy? I don't know, like I'm just riffing here, but maybe you can go away and next week come back. Tell me what kind of simile you think can describe your spiritual practice or your meditation or something. Next week, people of the early Buddhist texts. So come for a glimpse of the wild and wacky characters who existed just like you exist back at the time of the Buddha. And then, like I said, session after that is meditation. So thank you for coming. I'm glad we had a break and then couldn't look at any similes. I really look forward to seeing you next week, and I thank you for your attention. And please make sure you come and utilize this wonderful space of the library. All around the shelves here are books about these texts, and you can borrow these books as well to get to know them. You can also find these texts online in places like Sut Central, and you don't need to have a whole heap of knowledge, just go random. And in this way, you really broaden your spiritual practice, and you'll add layers of richness that will make your life happy and meaningful. And this is why I share these teachings with you. So I hope it'll be useful now or in the future. So thank you very much. Have a good night. I can stick around if you have some questions. Otherwise, safe travels back home.
Thank you, Brother. Thank you.